Hello.
Good morning or good evening. Good evening and good morning to you very early.
Good afternoon.
Buonasera, Paolo.
Ciao.
How are you? This is our last but not least, as we say, panel of our conference with the title Putting the Media Systems Model into the test. And I have the pleasure in our panel to have two distinguished colleagues and I hope friends at the same time. Two distinguished colleagues in media studies and both members of our scientific board, Daniel Hallin and Paolo Mancini. Daniel Hallin is distinguished professor of communication at the University of California in San Diego. His research centers on journalism, political communication, and comparative analysis of media systems. Recently, he has turned his attention to the comparative analysis of media systems, focusing on Western Europe and on Latin America, and trying to bring into political communication and media studies the tradition of comparative political and institutional analysis that can be found in sociology and comparative politics. Most recently, Daniel has been doing research on health and medical reporting and the mediatization of health and medicine. Paolo Mancini, on the other hand, is full professor of the Department of Political Science at the University of Perugia. His research focuses on the relationship between mass communication systems and the political system and on the study of electoral campaigns. His articles have been published in most prestigious journals, I would say, in the field of media studies, and he has been several times visiting professors in various universities around the globe. Now, their book, the so-called Hallin and Mancini's comparative, or Mancini's and Hallin comparing media systems, three model of, if I read it well, of media and politics. I have to say, first of all, that is has won the outstanding book awards of the National Communication and National Communication Associations, and the Gold Goldsmith Book Award of the Sorenstein Center on Press and Politics at Harvard. Now, their model, which is in this book for comparing media systems across countries, serves as a theoretical landmark, if I can put it in this way, for most comparative media system studies, and can still, I think, provide a useful framework for current comparative research on the media field. It is also related to one of the main questions of our EUMEPLAT, as we call it, project, if there is any European media system, for example, what is the place of Europe when compared to the national partners of newspapers and broadcasting, or to the regional organization of media systems, as they have it in the model, or to the global hegemony led by American contents and services. As some scholars suggest, media systems are points of convergence of political, economic, social, and cultural forces grounded in the local, the national, and the global, and we'll think of them as analytical units to understand how and where multiple dynamics intersect, as well as the comparative weight of factors and institutions in shaping the media. Daniel Hallin and Paolo Mancini have identify, the so-called four dimensions of analysis that we do in our program as well. But I have to say, since the publication of this book in 2004, if I remember well, there have been some prominent, I would say, attempts trying to put into test the standardized measures of this framework. So I do hope Dan and Paolo will tell us more about the fate, if I can put it this way, of their models. So thank you again. Who wants to start first? You, Daniel, or you, Paolo? I'll give the platform to Daniel as our guest from very far away.
Okay, thank you, Stylianos. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
It's 7:30 in the morning here on the Pacific Coast, and it's a beautiful day in San Diego, not necessarily usual for the spring. Let me also put the timer on my... Okay. So let me just briefly say a little bit in response to Stylianos' question about the fate of the models and so on. And then I want to turn and say a little bit about the question of, is there a European media system, and how I would think about that from the point of view of just the analysis of media systems in general, and then say a little bit more about change in media systems, which I think is in some ways the greatest challenge we face in, in thinking about how to analyze media systems. So how have things gone with our models? I would say reasonably well. That is to say, there's a lot of confirmation about the pattern of differences that we have found, and a lot of scholars have found a lot of utility to the dimensions, you could say, or I think it was a mistake to use the term dimensions. I like to call them domains, because people often assume that they're supposed to be unidimensional, that all of the aspects are supposed to somehow vary together within those domains. And in fact, I think that it was never our intent. Excuse me.
We can't hear you, Dan. Daniel, you can't hear you.
You are lost.
Yes, now. Okay.
I cannot hear you.
Now?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. There's a little switch on my headset, and if I accidentally bump it, it turns me off. Okay. One of the study by Brueggemann and colleagues that shows 4 different models within Europe is one that I think makes sense, right? And it emphasizes the fact that, in identifying 3 models, in some ways, this was a pragmatic thing, right? That is to say, we were organizing the book in terms of 3 chapters. We needed to keep some degree of parsimony in the system. And of course, we could have multiplied it. I think in many ways, for example, within the polarized pluralist system, Spain, I think, is different from Italy and Greece in important ways. But the particular distinction that they found between the 2 different sets of polarized pluralist of democratic corporatist countries, I think makes sense and fits with a lot of other research on the difference between more social corporatist and liberal corporatist systems. So it just emphasizes, among other things, the fact that when you're making media system topologies, they're conceptual tools, and you can break things down in different ways. And there's no one right way to break them down. It's a matter of choice about what's most useful. Now, as to the question of, is there a European media system? Well, Paolo and I were talking over this a bit. The answer is obviously yes and no. And I'm sure Paolo will give his particular version of that. And the point that I want to make here is that in general, media systems in general can be analyzed at different levels, right? So in ecology, if you're studying a forest as an ecosystem, this is a particular level, but you may also study a pond within that forest as an ecosystem and a log within that forest as an ecosystem. And similarly, you of course have to understand the forest as part of a wider regional and global ecosystem. So I think it's the same with media systems, right? That you can understand them at different levels. In Europe, there have always been important processes of mutual influence among European national media systems once they began to become national. The Napoleonic Wars were one context for that. Later on, cross-border broadcast flows became another context for that. In some ways, of course, this accelerated a lot with the formation of the EU, with the creation of common political institutions and the effort to harmonize media regulations, the effort to create the so-called common European audiovisual space. I've heard people say that Europe becomes less relevant because of the dominance of US tech companies, but here from the US, I think it seems to us that European regulation on tech companies is actually a very important influence, and kind of blows back into the United States and affects policy here in important ways. So I think in that way, Europe is actually an important actor in the tech world. But obviously at the same time, it's always been clear, and there's continued confirmation of the fact that European national media systems differ from one another, and the differences are quite persistent and extend into the area of new media. They don't seem to be disappearing by any means. There's also a large body of research that shows the domestication of political issues within the European Union. So it seems pretty clear that the national level of analysis remains very important. And I think this is true at the world level as well. So it's very important to keep in mind the different levels and to carry out media system analysis at all of the different levels. Now, the next thing I'd like to do is to shift to the question of change in media systems, which to me is the greatest challenge facing the analysis of media systems today. Media system change, rapid change in media systems today, that's generated in part by technology, by the rise of the internet, but also by political changes, I would say political crises in national political systems in much of the world, have forced us to think increasingly about media system change. I've often heard the argument that the concept of system implies stasis, but I've always rejected that concept. It seems to me that that's absolutely not the case, and that the concept of system is absolutely essential to understanding change, in the sense that we understand media systems as interrelated wholes, and so we can see the ways in which different changes affect one another and accumulate, and also in many cases the origins of those changes in the dynamics of the system. But I do think that it's making us think differently about media systems and emphasize this aspect of it. I think that's an important kind of cutting edge of the field. I do want to underscore that change is not new, right? Although we may have entered a period when everybody's talking about change, change is not new. So in Europe, in the post-World War II period, that's the focus of our analysis in comparative in comparing media systems. These systems were obviously much more stable in that period, most of them, than European media systems in the preceding period, and perhaps more stable than the current period. But there was a lot of change going on in that post-World War II period that we were writing about. There was the rise of commercial newspapers, which eventually displaced the party press, which was dominant in the period immediately after World War II in much of Europe. There was the rise of television, which in many cases undermined political parallelism. There was the shift from party democracy to audience democracy. All of these were very important changes that were going on in that period. The liberal model countries of our analysis, and in particular the US, were probably more stable overall during that period, but important changes did take place there that would include the rise of critical professionalism, a shift in journalistic professionalism toward a more active role, and also the popularization of news, I think was an important change that took place in this period that also affected Europe. Find my second page here of notes. But I would also say that even if the liberal countries were more stable for much of the post-war period, the pace of change is probably particularly intense right now in the United States compared with other Western countries. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the US case as an example here. The most consequential change in the US case, of course, is the rise of partisan media and the general increase in political parallelism. This has roots in two different kinds of processes. The first is a change in political culture, which many political scientists agree began actually in the 1970s. So it's important that it's a change that has deep roots, goes back way before the internet, and it also started before a lot of the changes in media. So it's not, in its initial phase, a media-driven shift. It's driven by civil rights movement and women's movement and all kinds of changes in American society in that period. But obviously, also, it has these deep roots, but it has become especially evident in the Trump era as one of the two parties became, in effect, an anti-system party, and consensus began to break down on the fundamental rules of the game of democratic politics. So that's a very dramatic change in American political culture that has come about in recent years. The second root of this shift toward political parallelism in the United States was the shift from monopoly or oligopoly media markets to more competitive ones, with the result that certain media began to use political identity as a means of creating a market niche, which was the case earlier in the history of the US media system in the 19th and early 20th century. Then it disappeared in the middle of the 20th century in the context of these monopoly and oligopoly media markets. And then it reemerged with the development of multi-channel media, radio, cable television, and eventually the internet. There's also another development that's related to this that's gotten a lot of attention recently, and that's the decline of local media in the United States. There was an article by Dar, Hitt, and Dunway that appeared in Journal of Communication in 2018 that made this point. It made the point that in the United States, discourse about local issues tends to be more pragmatic and less ideological. Which means that the decline of local media, which at one time were very central in the US media system, and the shift toward national media reinforces this shift toward more ideological politics. And this is something that's gotten a lot of attention in the United States recently, in part because the pandemic has accelerated the death of local media. And just last week, Obama was making reference to this research in an interview that he gave. This is a point that's also made in an article by Efrat Nechushtai. She makes the argument about the nationalization of media markets in the United States, which makes them more similar in certain ways to European media systems. And she makes that argument in the context of developing a wider argument that the US has moved in important ways in the direction of the polarized pluralist model. So she proposes, the term of a polarized liberal system to refer to what the United States is becoming. Here, I would say it's important to stress that the shift toward partisanship in the US is uneven. It's more marked on the right of the political spectrum than the left, and it's still characteristic of certain niche media more than it is of the media that reach the largest section of the public. So the big legacy media, the New York Times or the Washington Post, also the major broadcast networks, and also a lot of net native digital media that follow this model, Politico would be an example, are really not partisan in the way that Fox News is, or the way that, say, the Huffington Post is. They still cling to most of the elements of traditional professional norms, I would say. And in that sense, I wouldn't exaggerate the changes. Although I would add that this year especially, a series of dramatic events, which includes, first of all, the pandemic, secondly, the Black Lives Matter movement, and finally, the refusal of Trump and most of his party to accept the results of the election, have forced mainstream journalists in the United States to rethink the idea of objectivity in a way that they never have before. And there's very interesting discussion going on today in the United States about objectivity. And it's forced them to take stances in a way that they never would have done before in defense of consensus values and in defense of a commitment to reality-based discourse, we would say. And so, this is very clearly illustrated in the very routine tendency now to, talk about Trump's lies about the election in very explicit terms. That's just not the way U.S. journalists wrote at one time. Of course, in the context of the current polarization in American politics, this makes those mainstream media appear partisan to a large section of the population, even though they don't think of that as a partisan stance. And even though professional practices, I would say, have not moved as far in the direction of polarized pluralist models as in most of the mainstream media as they have in other parts of the media. And it reinforces a tendency that has been documented strongly in research for political parallelism in audience patterns, right? In patterns of media consumption and also trust in media to develop very strongly in the United States. So this is a very important change in the US media system, is the development of political parallelism in audience use patterns. So I'm going to move to wrap up now, and then I'm happy, I assume we have a question and answer period later on. I'm happy to elaborate more about what's going on in the U.S. media system in this fairly extraordinary year. But wrapping that discussion up and starting to think about general implications for the study of media systems, I think that one of the things we don't know yet is how much of what we're seeing in the U.S. media system will prove to be transitory, a kind of a conjunctural thing. One point I'll make in general here is that I think that media systems change in a lot of ways. Some of the change is short term, right? There are different kinds of conjunctures, and media behave differently in different kinds of conjunctures. So we might say this is a particular conjuncture that the US is going through, or we might say that there's a long-term change going on. And we don't really know which of those is true. Important changes have taken place in the US media system, and I haven't touched on all of them here, but it's possible that some of the changes that we see now will prove to be a product of the Trump era, a particular leader, and as Trump passes into irrelevance, which I think he probably will, it may be that some will prove to be temporary. Certainly for journalists in the mainstream media in the United States, they don't like the position that they are in today, taking strong stances of this sort. It's very uncomfortable for them, and I think that they worry that it will prove unsustainable. So they would love to move back towards something that they consider more normal. We'll see if they're able. But clearly there have been big changes in US media systems. So how do we think about this from the point of view of media systems theory? Do we interpret this as a sign that the United States has moved from one model to another? Perhaps it's become a mixed case, between the liberal and the polarized pluralist model. Or do we perhaps think of that the liberal model has declined and been replaced by a new emerging model and basically will belong to the past, and we need to develop a new set of models to understand where a system like the United States is going on in the future? Or perhaps a third alternative would be to say that the liberal model has different states, and it may shift between these different states as conditions change. This is a kind of a standard way that systems theory is used in a lot of different areas of science, is to think about change in response to system environment and so on. And you imagine systems as having these different kinds of states. And you imagine a system as a kind of a pattern of variation among these states. After all, to push a little in the direction of that particular interpretation, the core of what the liberal model is has not changed in the US, and that is a system in which commercial market-based media are dominant. That much is common. And as Paolo and I pointed out originally, in comparing media systems, different levels of political parallelism have always existed in liberal systems, right? The US used to have partisan media, and Britain always had partisan media, right? At least in the press sector. So it may be that these different levels of political parallelism are all part of the range of variation of a liberal system, and we need to refine our theory then to understand why you have shifts between them within the liberal model. So these three different ways of interpreting the change, which one is the right way? How would we show it? I would say that there's probably no right answer to this question of which is the right interpretation of the change, because media systems theories, after all, are just conceptual tools, and all of these different ways of thinking about system change may have value. What's more interesting is really the detail, that is, our analysis of what forces push for the change, what forces account for the change, and also what we can learn about why changes take place more in one system than another. Why does the internet, for example, not produce polarization and misinformation in Norway as it in the same way that it does in the United States? So I think those kinds of questions are the kinds of questions that we need to move on to now. And I'll finish there.
Well, okay. Thank you very much. I think before we start questions, I think it's better to listen to hear Paolo as well, and then to have a round table discussion. What do you think?
Yes, I agree. Absolutely, yeah.
Paolo,
Okay,
the platform is yours, Paolo.
Yes, thanks. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to Stylianos Papathanassopoulos, but also to Andrea Miconi for this invitation. I have a problem, and the problem is that I will try to say something different from what Dan has said. I will stress the differences, but it's not easy to do this. And nevertheless, I will try to be how to say different from him. First of all, I prepared a draft, and also I prepared a couple of slides. I'm not sure to be able to show you the slides, but before going into the presentation that I prepared, let me say something in connection to the initial question by Stelios, the fate of our models. I would answer in a very general way. In 2021, we would not write the book as we wrote in 2004, of course. This is very stupid answer, but our book would be very different. Would be very different for at least two reasons that Dan has already put on the table. First of all, in the book, we wrote the last chapter was about homogenization. And in that chapter, we stated that even if with different levels, with different speeds, but the European models, the Central European and the Mediterranean models of journalism were going towards the liberal model that we found in United States. So there was a process of commercialization, and the democratic corporatist was becoming more liberal. The polarized pluralist too was becoming more liberal. But the fact is that, as Dan has said, the fact is that the model that we observed in the United States in 2004 is going in the different direction. It's going towards the polarized pluralist model. And I'm not sure that this started with Trump. This started even before Trump. Actually, I guess this is my idea. The polarization of of the liberal model in the United States started with, I would say, with Obamacare, with the Tea Party, and with the fact that, for instance, Fox News strongly took the side of the opponents of the Obamacare. So, in a way, it was, in my view, the presidency of Obama that caused the sort of polarization of the American media and political system. Of course, then it came Trump, and everything was different. But this is the first reason why we would not write the book in the same way we wrote in 2004. The second reason for a different book is the fact is the digital revolution. It is true, as Dan said, that changes there have always been also in Europe and all through worldwide. Television was a dramatic change in the proceedings, in the practice of journalism, in the structure of media system, in connection to print. So television was a big shift, and before television there have been other important reason for shift. But my idea is that the digital revolution implies a more dramatic, and much deeper changes of entire society. And this is affecting not just the media, but politics too. And this is what I will try to say later on. So let's see if I can share my slides, share screen. Here it is. Okay, where it is? Okay, no, it does not work. Excuse me.
Yeah.
See if I can see how to share the screen. This is not where it is. Okay, anyway.
Choose the one that you want to share with us.
Excuse me?
Choose the file that you want to share with us, and it will come out.
Yes, let me...
Open your file on your desktop, and then from the share, choose this one.
Can you see the slide? No.
Can't see anything.
Okay, forget about this. Let me say, I divided my presentation in two parts. The first part is try to answer the general question of your project. Does a European media system exist? This is the first question I will try to address. And then I will try to address another issue, what the possible consequences of digital revolution. Because as I said, I think that digital revolution implies a strong, deep, and dramatic changes in the news media system. Now, does a European media system exist? Dennis already gave the right answer, yes and no. Yes and no. In this regard, this was my slide. I like to repeat a statement that three Nordic scholars wrote in 2008, Strombach, Horst, and Alberg, when they discussed our book, Comparing Media System. They wrote this sentence: models might be reasonable from a global or international perspective. It will trigger the question as to whether the Nordic countries really are so similar to each other as suggested by Hallin and Mancini. Certainly, this is the important part of the statement, certainly from an everyday Swedish, Finnish, or Danish perspective, the differences between their own country and the other northern countries might often be as prominent as the similarities. So, yes and no. It depends from which is your point of view, where you look at the similarities and differences. So, for a Norwegian scholar, differences with a Swedish or Finnish scholar are more important than similarities. But if you look at the Nordic countries from outside, from an Australian point of view, from even an Italian or Greek point of view, probably similarities are stronger than differences. So there are similarities and there are different differences also, depending on where you place yourself, where you place your point of observation. Similarities. Let me try to say which are the major similarities that I can see today. One important similarity of the European media systems, if compared with media system beyond Europe, has to do the similarity have to do with the historical and presence of organized mass parties. Even if the importance of organized mass party has dramatically decreased over time, nevertheless, if you look at situation, at countries, at contexts outside of Europe, the political dimensions of the news media is much less important. And in any case, the fact that there have been important mass parties in Europe is still affecting the news media situation today, has affected strongly the media situation in the past, and nevertheless, consequences of the past existence of mass parties is still there, is still affecting the way in which journalists behave, in the way in which the news media are structured. So the past existence of mass parties said important effect still is affecting the present situation of news media in Europe. And this is, in my view, is an important difference with the situation of news media outside of Europe, where the existence of mass parties was not so important, was not so dramatic, was not so long in a way. And this is an important difference. Europe, the political and media situation of Europe has always been affected by the strong importance of organized mass parties. And this existence is still affecting the way in which news media in Europe behave. And this is a similarity. This is something that puts the European system close to each other, much more than close to situations and countries outside of Europe. So the first similarity is the existence, the European history of the last 2 centuries is strongly been affected by the role, by the existence of organized mass parties, and consequences are still alive today. First similarity. Second similarity, the welfare state democracy, the culture of welfare state democracy, and therefore the role of a state. The role of a state in Europe, with different levels, different importance, nevertheless, is still important if compared with the situations outside of Europe. The culture of welfare state democracy, what means? It was press subsidies in the northern country, but everywhere in Europe at different levels. The important role of the state as a regulator. This is something that you find at different levels all over Europe, and that you don't find in other countries, in countries outside of Europe. Or if you find comparatively in a much less, with much less importance. So these are the two important dimensions that make the European media system close to each other. The existence, the past existence of political mass parties, and the culture of welfare state that is strongly based in Europe, much more than in other countries. I think these are similarities that make the European media system close to each other. Of course, there are differences. The Greek media system is different from the Swedish, which are the difference. Dan has already said something at this regard. For instance, the different levels of overlapping between media and politics. As we wrote in the book, it is much stronger in the polarized pluralist country. In the Mediterranean countries, is less important, even if it was important in the Nordic country. But there are differences in the level of overlapping. There are differences in the level of political parallelism. And this is an important difference that exists among the European media system. The level of commercialization. This is the second difference that I think is very important. The level of commercialization, and that goes together with the role of the state as regulator. As I said, this is a similarity, but also the level of the state as a regulator makes an important difference in the way in which commercialization takes place in different parts of Europe. Nevertheless, I think that the most important difference that exists among the European news media systems is what we define in our book, the level of rational legal authority. Because there are important differences in the political culture of the countries, of European countries, in the level of clientelism versus universalism, in the level of instrumentalization, and also in the level of professionalization that has to do, the level of professionalization that has to do, that has much to do with rational legal authority. I think this is if there is the major difference, let's put this way, that I find, that I can observe among the European media systems has to do with different political culture and what we define in the book of the level of rational legal authority. Italy, in spite of the changes that have taken place over the years, is still a clientelistic country. Much more clientelistic than Sweden or Norway. And this makes a big and important difference in the media system. I think this is a very important difference that still exists. So the answer is there a European media system? Yes, if you compare European media systems with media systems outside of Europe. No. If you compare the European media system among themselves. What Stromberg said, if you look from a Swedish perspective, a Finnish media system, it will be different. But if you look at the Swedish and Finnish system from a Greek point of view, you see many similarities, many more similarities than differences. So it depends on which is your point of observation. Let me say something about the consequences of digital revolution that can have in the media system and in general also in the similarities and differences in the European media system. I already wrote about this in several papers, and I gave different presentation about this. The biggest consequence of digital revolution, in my view, is a process of deinstitutionalization. Digital media makes institutions, both in the field of media, but also in the field of politics, much less important. Deinstitutionalization means that there is a transfer of social functions and power from established institutions as the parties, as the newsroom organization, as the ethical committee or the press subsidy, whatever, towards a single dispersed citizen. Power and functions are progressively passing from institutions, established institutions, they are going towards single dispersed citizen. And this takes place both in the field of media and, even more important, in the field of politics as well. So deinstitutionalization is the major consequence of the digital revolution. In the field of news media, there is a transfer of functions from news outlets working depending on fixed rules and proceedings to blogs, social media, Facebook, Twitter, citizen journalism. So the news are not produced anymore. They are still produced, of course. But more and more, the production and the circulation of news has to do with single citizen more than with established institutions as newspaper organization, professional organization. This means that rules for professionals become less and less important. There are less and less rules for professionals. This is the process of the institutionalization. If you work in a newsroom, You have to follow fixed proceedings. There is a meeting at 11 in the morning, then there is another meeting at 4 o'clock, and there the decisions are taken. If you look in a newsroom organization, you have to follow what your editor tells you. But if you are a blogger, if you are on Facebook, if you are on Twitter, you don't have to listen to anyone. You don't have to follow any rules. And this is the institutionalization. So no rules, or much less rules for professional journalists. If we can talk again of professional journalists, there are no borders, no national borders, or less important national borders. This is the institutionalization. There is less control, and this is a dramatic shift, I think. Probably much more important than the shift that television, when it was born, brought to the entire media system. So the institutionalization, this is the consequence, in my view, the most important consequence of the process of the digital. I prepared a slide with a sentence. By a book by John Lloyd. John Lloyd is a media scholar, but was an important journalist of Financial Times. And he wrote in his last book, there is a new vision of journalism, call it the author school, in which the business shift from being organized by institutions to being organized around single journalists with discrete following. So from institutions to single journalists. This is the institutionalization in the field of media. But the institutionalization takes place all through Europe, all through the world, in a way, also in the field of politics. From politics, organized around stable and long-lasting institutions, the mass parties. In many parts of the world, this means the end of traditional political parallelism. So there is a shift from organized institutions, mass parties, to what there is an interesting paper that two Italian scholars, Mattoni and Cecobelli, wrote in a paper that was published in European Journal of Communication. And again, trying to apply to the new digital era our interpretative model, they talk today of non-elite and more unconventional politics. This is what they stress. Digital revolution has brought a process of what we call non-elite. It's not leaders, not political members, but single citizens that have the opportunity to take a much more active role in politics. And this means also unconventional politics, in a way not based around established institutions as the mass parties. So this brings the end of organized mass parties. Single citizen that can interact directly with the government. Unconventional parties, the Five Stars movement, Podemos in Spain, and many other movement, interrogation mark, parties, interrogation mark, movement that are not based on fixed rules, on fixed proceedings, on a hierarchy. This is what the institutionalization means, hierarchy, both in the field of media, but also in the field of politics, becomes less and less important. And this is what Mattoni and Cecobelli mean by unconventional, non-elite politics. Hierarchies, both in the field of media and in the field of politics, become less and less important. This is the process of the institutionalization. In a way, Trump himself is an indication of the institutionalization. he was fighting against his own party, basing his possible consensus just on digital media, outside of any fixed rules on any traditional habits of politics, unconventionality. Another consequence is volatility. Many parts of the world, politics is becoming more and more volatile. We see everywhere. Macron in France, he established his own party 4 months before the election day, and he won the election. Think also the blue and white party in Israel. But not to say about Italy, Five Stars movement that became the most important party in Italy in very few years. So volatility is another important mark of deinstitutionalization. Which are the consequences? And then I will stop here. In general, and this affects the European media system in general, deinstitutionalization is empowering the citizens, but also making them free from any links and therefore from any form of control. More dispersed individualism, not institutions, are losing the power that they had. Established institutions, both newsroom organization, news outlets organization, mass parties, are losing part of their power, transferring their functions to single dispersed citizen. And of course, within this process of deinstitutionalization, you can read the process of fake news, no control. If you work on a newsroom organization, within a newsroom organization, you are controlled. You are controlled by your editor, by many other figures. If you are a blogger, if you write on social media, if you use Twitter, you don't have any form of control. You can write whatever. So the fake news phenomenon itself can be interpreted within this process of that I call of the institutionalization. And here you have hate speech and polarization. To end, as Dan has already said, sorry about this. As Dan has already said, this is I would say this is a general phenomenon. This is a general tendency that you can say, that you can observe worldwide. But at the same time, it takes shape in different way in connection to the already existing situation of turbulence and volatility. So a general trend of change, general trend of shift, but nevertheless, the level of this shift depends on the level of turbulence and volatility that you find in each different countries. Again, similarities and differences, obviously, but you have to put these similarities and differences within each different social and political context. Ready for questions.
Thank you very much, Paolo. I have to admit I have become more confused right now, to be honest, in the sense that eventually, listening to Daniel, I will start thinking that eventually we're moving towards a kind of a polarized pluralism model, which is not ready yet, or we don't know whether we will go backward to the liberal model or whatever. And then listening to you, you speak more about this sense of similarities and dissimilarities, but eventually you use the, if I can put in this way, called indicator of the, which I totally agree with you, the technology change, the digitalization of the media environment. And the question which comes is whether that leads us to a kind of a homogenization of the media systems, or something very different related to the traditions and to the history of each country. In a book that I wrote with Ralph Green in 2011, if I remember well, we said that for us, media is politics, technology, economy, industrial policy, and diplomacy. So if we put in this let's say conjunction the European Union and the what I call the EU Europeanization, are we going somewhere or we're going nowhere? Too many questions.
This is a question.
Yeah.
Dan.
Well, one thing I would say is that does digitalization, one question that people have often raised is, does digitalization erase the differences among media systems, right? And homogenize them all, make them all this kind of individualist system of the individual bloggers and so on. And, you know, I think that the research gives that we have so far, we're just beginning to do this research, gives a kind of complex picture of that, right? So there are certain elements of the logic of social media and so on that you can see operating across systems, as was true with television, had its particular logics in some ways. But there's also a lot of evidence that digital media have different consequences and get implemented differently in different systems, right? So they don't always lead to increased political parallelism and polarization. They, you know, there's lots of studies that show strong differences between systems in the way digital media are implemented. One of the most recent is the book by Angèle Christine that looks at the use of audience metrics in digital journalism in the US and France, and shows that because of different traditions of professionalism and newsroom structure, the French and US journalists think of their place in the process very differently, the place of those audience metrics. So I think there's a kind of a complex picture. I'll make a couple of reactions to Paolo's response. Well, one of them just about timing of changes in the US. I would say, yes, it's absolutely true that the big changes started before Trump. In fact, in a lot of ways, I would say that Fox News, it's really Fox News, not Trump, that's the big innovator in the US. It was Fox that created the populist ideology that Trump rode into power. So you can push that back earlier. What the Trump era did was to push a lot of those changes into the mainstream media in a way that they hadn't been before, right? And because of the mainstream media have to respond to Trump. But a bigger issue to think about in terms of Paolo's presentation, deinstitutionalization. Yes, I think that that's an important effect of digital media, but I also think that, well, I think it's complicated there too. I mean, first of all, let's not forget about Google and Facebook as institutions, right? And their algorithms as structuring this process. And let's also not forget about entities like Fox News or Russian intelligence. I mean, I think that it would be, I think the deinstitutionalization tendency is important, absolutely. But I also think that we shouldn't forget about the structuring of social power, which is very far from the kind of vision that internet, you know, the kind of internet utopian vision of the early days of the internet, that the internet was going to break down all hierarchies of power and everybody would have an equal voice. And I think that we're seeing in some ways the opposite of that, right? We're seeing very great concentrations of power. So, yeah, I think that's one of the complexities of theorizing what the new media systems, the new political communications, how they actually work.
Yes, I completely agree with with this. I did not mention, but there is no doubt that together with the process of deinstitutionalization, also a process of reinstitutionalization takes place. A process of reinstitutionalization, but in the hands of different institutions than before. Private corporations, Google, Facebook, and so on. The power of Facebook, I mean, the Trump case has clearly demonstrated that Facebook has much more power than the US government. As Facebook that has closed, or Twitter that has closed the Trump site and not the government. So the institutions are taking different shape, are being built in the hands of different institutions than before. Not politics, not governments, but private corporations. I don't know where we'll go, but this is no doubt what is taking place. But this is complex. This is also, how to say, contradictory in connection to the process of the institutionalization I was talking before. To answer Stelios' question about, so what happens? Where is the beef? Homogeneity among Europe or differences? I would say that the answer is ambiguous. Yes and no. There is no way that polarization is increasing because of digital revolution. There is no way that echo chambers, Cassius time, exist everywhere. But the importance of echo chambers, the importance of a tendency toward polarization is different, is taking different shape in connection to the already existing situation. We cannot talk of a universal tendency. There are universal tendencies, in my view, yes, but they meet with already existing situation. As I like to say, and I start all my presentation with this statement, journalism does not grow up in a vacuum. All phenomena take place within a contextual situation. There are a tendency, universal tendency, polarization, yes, but also this tendency that has some universal value takes place differently in connection to different social and political contexts.
Okay. Do you think that with the pandemic, the state will, take a more, come back, take a more leading role in the media systems in Europe? Because
very likely, yes.
Side effects of the pandemic, of course.
Very likely, yes. There are. I'm not sure about the English literature on this, but there are many books, at least appearing in Italy, that stress the comeback of role of a state in the era of pandemic.
I see a question by Nico
Yes,
Carpentier in the chat, so maybe I'll answer that one. Doesn't deinstitutionalization show the other way around, the importance of professional procedures in journalism? Yes, I think that there's an important argument to be made for that, right? And here I think that Chadwick's argument is right. That is to say that this new role of bloggers and citizen, activist journalists and so on is important change. I noticed that, the Pulitzer Prizes were announced a couple of days ago, and the teenage girl who recorded the the video of the murder of George Floyd was given a Pulitzer Prize, right, for that. So this is an interesting sign of the change. But at the same time, it seems pretty clear that organized, large-scale news organizations are really important. We saw that in part during the Trump era in the United States. When Trump was first elected, a lot of people were talking, okay, this is the end of the mainstream media. But in fact, the audiences for the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, they all skyrocketed after the election of Trump. And also the centrality of those media as to the flow of information increased, because there were all of these leaks from within the Trump administration that were channeled through those legacy news organizations. And then it's also very clear that the new media that have different values, different professional cultures, including Fox News, those also have their own procedures. They are also bureaucracies that have their own procedures. I mean, Fox News, I think, in fact, is actually much more hierarchical and controlled than a traditional news organization. The journalists there, the rank and file journalists, have less autonomy there than a traditional news organization. So this is one of the ways in which I think that this picture of the deinstitutionalization is actually very complex. But yeah, professional journalists are important, and I think that there's been a kind of a renewed focus on why they matter with things like the pandemic and in the U.S. case, the Trump administration, and the issues of misinformation that come up around it.
I didn't see the question by Nico. I see it right now. I would say this is a very idealistic question. It would be nice to have more professional procedure routines, but this is not what is taking place right now. Journalists can have, it would be better to have professional habits, but the institutionalization is pushing in the other way. This is what takes place today. It would be better to have a professional proceedings, professional rules, no doubt about this, but this is not what is taking place. Reality is going in a different direction. There is no way about this.
I think Dan disagrees, or not.
In part, I disagree. Yes, right. No, I mean, I think that in the U.S. case, the role of professional routines, I mean, they survive. They're changing, but they survive, and their importance in some ways increased. I also noticed that there's definitely a process of professionalization of digital media that's taken place, right? So a lot of net native media came along, and at first they looked very, very different from traditional news organizations, but very often they then started professionalizing, right, and hiring people from mainstream news organizations. And like the Huffington Post started out with unpaid writers, and then it started hiring a staff and paying people. And so there was a kind of a convergence between mainstream news culture and that blogging culture. And of course, the influence goes both ways in some ways. But I think that digital media disrupted the existing system, but they didn't completely displace it. And there are ways in which the reasons for a lot of the institutional structures, those reasons are still there. I mean, the institutional structures developed because they had certain functions, and I think that they are redeveloping in a lot of the new media. So there will be change in the system, but continuity also.
Okay. Nico Carpentier is very acting right as questions, I think. It says that when Paolo was talking about European similarities, it was very much on the socio-political content, the welfare state. I would say yes. Is there something inherently that he has European in the media systems in Europe? Similarities related to media themselves?
Public service broadcasting, I would say. It's part of the welfare state that Paolo was talking about. That's a really important difference between European media and most of the world.
Yeah, I agree with
and the way that we use public service broadcasters.
And, as Paolo also said, regulation, right? I mean, there's much more regulation of media of certain types in Europe than in other parts of the world. I mentioned that from the US point of view, European regulations on tech companies, including privacy regulations and so on, that's really distinctive and important.
Yeah, but don't we follow? I mean, the American, the U.S. Legislation.
No, that's not how it seems here. I mean, to us, it seems the Europeans are always ahead on those things and have much stronger regulations than we do, and so we kind of look to those, and they say, well, and we say, well, should we perhaps have privacy rules like they have in Europe, which we're now beginning to have in California, for example.
Yeah, but think of the initiatives of the European Union in connection to limiting the power of digital corporations. This has been very important. The regulation on privacy and so on. This is much more European than in other parts of the world. Even if Biden is taking a different path at the moment, it seems, at least with a taxation on the gaining of corporations. But we'll see what happens in connection to this.
Paolo, do you think that the EU, through the policy transfer and various legislation on the media, will lead us to a kind that the European media systems to become more similar than dissimilar as we are now?
This is very...
all Europeans would like to become like the American system, the US system.
No, I think that, again, the role of European Union is very important also in the field of culture and in the field of media. Think of Erasmus exchange. The Erasmus exchanges is very important phenomenon that makes European young persons close each other. There is no way. And the initiative that European Union is taking place, even if there are limitations and resistances, nevertheless, there is a push towards a sort of Europeanization of a culture that includes also the field of media. I have no doubt about this. This is a slow process, but still going on. So, in a way, I would say that that European media are going to be much closer to each other in the future than different, because of the role of digital technology, because of the role also of European Union.
Yeah. So in the past, in your book, both you and Daniel used to say there are two factors. One will be one of them, the main factor will be the globalization. So can we say that the globalization has been replaced by the initiatives of the European Union, at least in Europe, for the homogenization?
No, because there are other elements that are of globalization that, like the role of the tech platforms, right, that are also important. Because there is I mean, it is true that there is this kind of a logic of social media that's partly rooted in the algorithms of Facebook and Google and so on, and it has influence everywhere. Even it gets modified like everything else by local conditions, but it is an effect of globalization. And I think that it is true, even though I wouldn't exaggerate the importance of it, is that there's an intensification of cross-border flows, right, of culture and so on. And I think the intensification is stronger within Europe, but it's an intensification that's global. To me, it's an interesting thing that now, like, for example, British media like The Guardian and the Daily Mail have readerships in the United States, just as, the New York Times has readerships in Europe. And that's something that the internet has produced that's an important change.
And Netflix has been everywhere in Europe.
And Netflix is everywhere, right? Yeah, I study Latin America. Netflix is really undercutting some of the big media powers in Latin America in serious ways. So that's an important development in cultural industries.
And I have seen more European productions on Netflix, speaking not only British, but Spanish, French, or even Turkish on Netflix than on the Greek television, for example, which is another thing on how the American-led or Americanized media may work towards the so-called Europeanization of Europe or the European culture, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
It may be, yeah.
Anyway, is there any other questions from other? I can't see any other question from the floor. All right. Now, I don't know if you want to add anything more. The things that you already have said. Eventually, we're going for one European model or many European models.
Well, as I say, it's the same point that Paolo made. It depends on the point of view, and it depends on what comparison you want to make. You can think of it in those different ways, and there's value in both of them. So if you compare Europe with other parts of the world, you can ask this question: is there a European model? And you can say, well, yes, there are some certain distinctive characteristics. And if you want to look with inside Europe, you can say, yeah, there's a lot of differences that still persist.
Okay, Paolo, your last word.
I'm ready to come to Athens.
Okay.
And next meeting in Athens.
In Athens. Person. Of course. And it's Adziki.
Yes, of course.
All right. Thank you so much, both of you, for being with us and sharing your thoughts. Let's hope meeting you in person in Athens, in Rome, or elsewhere. Here we have one of the meetings of our project. And I'd like once again to thank you for being with us and sharing your thoughts and ideas and comments and speaking about your work and the afterwards of your work.
Okay. Thank you, Stylianos. Thanks to all the audience.
Yeah. Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.